Can you stand?
Yeah, help me up.
I've got you. To the car.
They're close.
Ji-suk, the city's most feared mafia boss, has just been betrayed by his own men. As the Ghost King collapses into the darkness, a luxury SUV screeches to a halt. Na-bai, a high-powered executive with a flawless reputation, steps out into the storm. She thinks she's just hit a man with her car, but she's actually stumbled into a death sentence. "Who are you?" Ji-suk whispers as he wakes up in a sterile hospital bed, his lethal eyes now clouded and empty. Na-bai's mind races. Her board of directors is waiting for her to fail, and her family is breathing down her neck to marry. Desperate to cover up the accident and secure her corporate throne, she tells the ultimate lie. "You're Jean. You're my fiancé, and we're getting married tomorrow." Now, a man who used to rule the underworld with a single word is living in a luxury penthouse, playing the part of a house husband. He's obedient, protective, and dangerously obsessed with Na-bai. But as his muscle memory returns, he isn't just protecting her. He's hunting anyone who dares to cross her. Na-bai thought she saved a victim, but she's just realized she brought a predator into her bed, and he's starting to remember exactly who he is. The rain washed over the city, but it couldn't clean the blood off the pavement. Ji-suk leaned heavily against a rusted dumpster, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Only an hour ago, he was a Ghost King, the man who ruled the streets with a single look. Now his vision was fading. His own men, the ones who had sworn to die for him, had just tried to put him in the ground. The king is dead. His second-in-command had sneered before the final blow landed. A heavy pipe struck Ji-suk's head, sending him into a world of darkness. He collapsed just as the bright beams of a car's headlights cut through the heavy downpour. Na-bai slammed on her brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. She was a woman of logic and order, a corporate executive who had spent years building a reputation that was spotless. She was tired, stressed about a multi-million-dollar merger, and definitely not prepared to find a dying man in a designer suit in front of her car. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the wet ground. "Sir? Oh, God! Please be alive," she whispered, kneeling beside him. When she saw the blood and the sharp, expensive cut of his gray suit, panic set in. She looked around the empty alley. If the police came, they wouldn't see a good Samaritan. They would see a black woman with a mysterious, half-dead man, and the headlines would destroy everything she had worked for. Her career would be over in a single night. "I can't let you die here," she muttered, her hand shaking as she pulled him toward the back seat of her SUV. He was heavy, but adrenaline gave her strength. At the hospital, the tension only grew. Na-bai stood in the hallway, her navy blazer ruined by rain and red stains. When the doctor finally came out, his face was confused. "He's stable, but there's a problem. The trauma to his head, he has no idea who he is." Na-bai walked into the room. Ji-suk was sitting up, bandages wrapped around his head. His eyes were intense, sharp and dangerous like a predator's, but as he looked at her, they softened into a deep, troubling confusion. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. Na-bai heard footsteps behind her. It was her mother, who had been hounding her for months to settle down, followed by a hospital administrator with a clipboard. They were looking for a name. They were looking for a reason for this mess. Na-bai looked at the man on the bed. He looked powerful, even in a hospital gown. If she claimed him, the questions would stop. The accident would become a private matter. She reached out and took his cold, strong hand. "Of course you know me," she said, her voice steady despite the lie. "You're Jean. You're my fiancé. We've been together for 2 years. Ji-suk stared at her, his brow furrowed as he tried to find a single memory of her. He found nothing, but the way she held his hand felt like an anchor. "My fiancé?" he repeated. "Yes." Na-bai lied, closing the trap. "And we are going home together." The drive to Na-bai's family estate was silent, but the tension in the car was thick enough to cut. Beside her, the man who was once a king of the underworld sat perfectly still. He was dressed in a tailored suit Na-bai had rushed to buy, and it fit his broad shoulders as if it were a second skin. He didn't remember his name, his crimes, or his power, but the way he carried himself made the very air in the car feel heavy. Remember, Nabai whispered as they pulled up to the massive iron gates. "You are Jean. You are a venture capitalist from overseas. We met at a business conference, and we've been married for 3 months. If you forget anything, just smile and let me do the talking." Ji-suk turned to her. His eyes were dark and intense, searching hers for a truth he couldn't find in his own mind. "I won't let you down, Nabai," he said. His voice was a low, smooth rumble that sent a shiver down her spine, one that wasn't entirely caused by fear. As they entered the grand dining room, Nabai's family was already waiting. Her mother sat at the head of the table, her eyes sharp and judgmental. Her brother, a man who lived to gossip, leaned back with a smirk. This was a family that valued status above all else, and they were ready to tear any commoner to pieces. "So, this is the secret husband," her mother said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "He looks capable, but can he speak for himself?" Nabai opened her mouth to intervene, but Ji-suk was faster. He didn't stumble. He didn't look nervous. Instead, he stood behind Nabai's chair and pulled it out for her with a grace that looked like it had been practiced for a lifetime. He then took his seat, his posture upright and commanding. "My apologies for the secrecy," Ji-suk said, his tone perfectly calm and sophisticated. "Nabai wanted to keep our happiness private until the timing was right. I'm sure a woman of your standing understands the importance of discretion." The room went quiet. Her mother's eyebrows shot up. Ji-suk wasn't just playing the part. He was dominating it. Throughout the dinner, he was the perfect accessory. He anticipated Nabai's needs before she could even ask, refilling her water and placing a supportive hand on the small of her back. Whenever her brother tried to trip him up with questions about finance, Ji-suk answered with a cold, logical brilliance that silenced the table. He looked at Nabai with a gaze so devoted and intense that for a moment, even she almost believed a lie. There was no trace of the blood-stained man from the alley. But as Nabai watched him effortlessly charm her difficult family, a cold knot formed in her stomach. He was too good at this. He was playing a role, but the power behind his eyes was real. She had told her family she married a gentleman, but as he smiled at her mother with a chillingly perfect expression, Nabai realized she might have brought something much more dangerous into her world. The sun had barely begun to peek through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Nabai's penthouse when she woke up. Usually, her mornings were a frantic blur of cold coffee and misalarms. But today, the air felt different. It was quiet, too quiet. A strange, rhythmic shink-shink-shink sound was echoing from a kitchen, steady and hypnotic. Nabai wrapped her silk robe tightly around her and stepped into the hallway. She stopped in her tracks. The digital security panel by her door, which she usually struggled to program, was glowing with a series of complex new codes. Every camera angle had been adjusted, covering every blind spot in the corridor. It looked less like a home security system and more like a fortress command center. She walked into the kitchen and froze. Ji-suk was standing by the marble island, bathed in the morning light. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and his white shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing the corded muscle of his forearms. He was focused, his eyes narrowed with a chilling intensity as he ran a professional whetstone along the edge of her largest chef's knife. Shink, shink. The blade glinted, so sharp it looked like it could cut through the air itself. On the counter, every other knife in her set was laid out in a perfect, terrifying row. They were polished to a mirror shine, their edges lethal. "Jean!" Nabai found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. He didn't jump. He didn't even flinch. He simply finished the stroke and set the knife down with a soft click. When he turned to her, the darkness in his eyes vanished, replaced by that soft, devoted Jean persona. "Good morning, Nabai," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "I noticed the perimeter was weak, so I tightened the encryption on your locks. And your tools were dull. A woman in your position shouldn't have to struggle with something as simple as a blunt blade." Nabai looked at the knives, then back at the security panel. A normal fiancé might have made pancakes or bought flowers, but this man had spent his morning securing her exits and sharpening weapons. It was a kind of care she didn't know how to process. It was protective, but it felt like the protection of a wolf guarding its territory. You know a lot about security," she managed to say, stepping closer. Ji-suk looked at his hands, his brow furrowing for a split second as if a memory was trying to break through the fog. It felt natural, he admitted, his voice dropping an octave, like my fingers knew the codes before my brain did. He stepped toward her, closing the gap until she could smell the faint scent of expensive soap and steel. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was light, but his presence was overwhelming. "Don't worry," he whispered, looking down at her with a gaze that was both tender and dominant. "No one is getting past those doors. You're safe now." Nabai nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was safe, but as she glanced at the row of razor-sharp blades, she couldn't help but wonder, was she safe with him, or was she just his most prized possession? The glass doors of the corporate headquarters slid open, and Nabai stepped out into the humid evening air. It had been a long day of fighting off board members who wanted her chair, and her head was throbbing. She looked toward her car, but her heart sank when she saw a familiar, expensive sports car blocking her path. Leaning against her driver's side door was Marcus, a rival executive who had been trying to sabotage her merger for months. He was a man who used his size and his family's money to intimidate anyone he couldn't outsmart. "Going somewhere, Nabai?" Marcus sneered, not moving an inch. "I heard the board meeting didn't go so well. Maybe if you spent less time playing boss and more time listening to men who actually know how to run a company, you wouldn't look so tired." Nabai tightened her grip on her briefcase. "Move your car, Marcus. I'm not in the mood for your games." Marcus laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until she was backed against the hood of her vehicle. "Or what? You'll cry to the chairman? You're a diversity hire who got lucky, and your luck just ran out." He reached out to grab her shoulder, but his hand never made it. A shadow moved from the side of the SUV. Before Marcus could blink, a hand, strong as iron, clamped down on his wrist. Ji-suk stepped into the light. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even breathing hard. He was just there, standing between Nabai and the bully like an immovable wall. "The lady asked you to move," Ji-suk said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the air feel thin. Marcus tried to yank his arm back, but Ji-suk didn't budge. "Who the hell are you? Let go of me before I have you arrested." Ji-suk slowly tilted his head. The Jean persona, the helpful, sweet husband, was gone. In its place was something ancient and terrifying. He looked at Marcus with a gaze so cold it seemed to freeze the blood in the other man's veins. It wasn't the look of a man who wanted to fight. It was the look of a man who had already decided how he would dispose of a body. There was no mercy in those eyes. There was no hesitation. It was the look of the Ghost King, a man who had stared down armies and never blinked. Marcus's bravado vanished instantly. His face turned a sickly shade of white, and his knees actually shook. He didn't know who this man was, but every instinct in his body screamed that he was standing next to death itself. I'm leaving," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking. Ji-suk released his wrist. Marcus scrambled into his car, fumbled with the keys, and sped away so fast his tires screeched. The silence returned to the parking lot. Ji-suk turned back to Nabai, and just like that, the monster disappeared. His eyes softened, and he reached out to take her heavy briefcase. "Are you all right, Nabai?" he asked gently. Nabai stared at him, her pulse racing. She had wanted protection, but as she looked at Ji-suk's calm face, she realized Marcus hadn't been afraid of a fight. He had been afraid of a predator. She had saved this man from an alleyway, but she was starting to realize that the world should be more afraid of him than he was of the world. The penthouse was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner. Nabai couldn't sleep. The way Ji-suk had handled Marcus in the parking lot kept playing in her mind like a movie. It wasn't just that he was strong. It was the way he looked at Marcus, as if Marcus wasn't even a person, just a bug to be crushed. She walked into the guest bedroom to check on him. The moon was bright, casting long, silvery shadows across the bed. Ji-suk was fast asleep, but his rest wasn't peaceful. He was tossed to one side, the silk sheets tangled around his waist. His breathing was heavy, and a thin layer of sweat made his skin glisten. As Nabai stepped closer to straighten the blanket, she stopped. His back was bare, and under the pale moonlight, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Sprawled across his broad shoulders and winding down his spine was a massive, intricate tattoo of a black dragon. Its scales were shaded with terrifying detail, and its golden eyes seemed to glow in the dark. It wasn't the kind of art you got at a local shop on a whim. This was a mark of status. Below the dragon, there were smaller, jagged scars, old bullet wounds and blade marks that told a story of 100 battles. Nabai's hand trembled as she hovered her fingers over the ink. She had told everyone he was a venture capitalist, a man of numbers and boardrooms. But businessmen didn't carry the Ghost King's mark on their skin. They didn't have bodies mapped out by violence. Suddenly, Ji-suk shifted. He let out a low, guttural groan and his muscles tensed. Even in his sleep, his hand flew out, catching Nabai's wrist before she could pull away. His grip wasn't painful, but it was like a shackle. He didn't wake up, but he held her there, anchored to him. Nabai looked from his scarred, tattooed back to his peaceful, sleeping face. The contrast was terrifying. Who was this man? She had saved him because she feared for her career, but now she feared for her life. She was looking at the evidence of a dark world she didn't understand. She realized then that Jean was a ghost she had created. The man lying in her bed was a king from a kingdom of blood, and no matter how many suits she bought him or how many lies she told her family, the dragon on his back was the only truth left. She had brought a wolf into her home, and the doors were already locked from the inside. She gently pried her wrist from his grasp and backed out of the room, her breath hitching in her chest. For the first time, she wasn't just worried about her reputation. She was worried about what would happen when the dragon finally opened its eyes. The following morning, the peace of the penthouse was shattered by a heavy, rhythmic pounding on the front door. Nabai hurried to the foyer, her heart racing. Before she could reach the handle, the door burst open. 3 large men in leather jackets pushed their way in, smelling of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. "Where is he?" the leader growled, kicking a designer vase aside. "Your brother owes us $50,000. We know he's hiding his money in this fancy cage of yours." Nabai stepped back, her hands raised. "My brother isn't here. Please leave now or I'll call the police." The men laughed, and one reached out to grab her arm. "You're coming with us until he pays up, princess." Suddenly, the air in the room turned ice cold. Ji-suk appeared from the hallway, moving with a silence that was unnatural. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket, and the dark ink of the dragon tattoo peeked out from his collar. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. "Take your hand off her," Ji-suk said. His voice was quiet, but it vibrated with a power that made the intruders freeze. The leader sneered, pulling a switchblade. "Step aside, pretty boy. This doesn't involve you." What happened next was a blur of motion. Ji-suk didn't hesitate. He moved like a shadow, disarming the man before the blade could even catch the light. With a sickening crack, he broke the man's wrist and sent him crashing into the marble floor. The other 2 lunged at him, but Ji-suk was a whirlwind of calculated violence. He didn't just fight, he dismantled them. He used his elbows and knees with professional precision, hitting pressure points that sent the men screaming to the ground. Nabai watched in the corner, her breath hitching. She was horrified by the sound of bone hitting bone, but she couldn't look away. There was a dark, terrifying beauty in the way he moved. He was a master of his craft, and that craft was pain. Within seconds, the 3 men were a broken heap on her rug. Ji-suk stood over them, his chest barely heaving. He leaned down and grabbed the leader by the throat, hoisting him up until the man's toes barely touched the floor. "If you ever come near this door again," Ji-suk whispered, his eyes devoid of any human emotion, "I won't just break your bones. I will make sure no one ever finds what's left of you." He tossed the man out like trash, and the other 2 scrambled after him, bleeding and terrified. Ji-suk closed the door and turned back to Nabai. The darkness in his face vanished instantly, replaced by a gentle concern. "Are you hurt, Nabai?" Nabai looked at the blood on the floor, then at the man who had just saved her. She felt a wave of fear, but beneath it, a strange, electric fascination. She had lied to the world about who he was, but she was starting to realize that the man she had created was far more powerful than the Mafia boss he had forgotten. The following Monday, Nabai decided there was only one way to keep an eye on the dragon in her home. She had to bring him to work. She dressed Ji-suk in a charcoal-colored suit that made him look like a high-level executive, though his silent, predatory walk told a different story. "You are my new personal assistant," Nabai told him as the elevator ascended to the top floor of the corporate tower. "You handle my schedule, you take notes, and most importantly, you stay quiet. Do you understand?" Ji-suk adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable. "I understand, Nabai. I will ensure your day runs without interruption." The moment they stepped onto the office floor, the atmosphere changed. Usually, the morning shift was a mess of gossiping employees and slow-moving interns. But as Ji-suk walked behind Nabai, a heavy, suffocating silence followed him. He didn't say a word, but his sharp jawline and intense, dark eyes seemed to scan every desk for a threat. The effect was instant. Employees who usually spent 20 minutes at the coffee machine scrambled back to their computers. The office pranksters suddenly found their work very interesting. No one knew who the new man was, but everyone could feel the natural dominance radiating from him. He looked like a man who didn't accept excuses or mistakes. During the morning briefing, Ji-suk stood behind Nabai's chair like a silent statue. When a department head tried to stutter through a late report, Ji-suk simply shifted his weight and looked at the man. He didn't frown or yell, but his cold, focused gaze made the department head break into a cold sweat. The man finished his presentation in record time, delivering the most accurate data Nabai had seen all year. By noon, the gene effect had taken over the entire building. The productivity levels were off the charts. People weren't just working. They were working with a desperate, terrified efficiency. Nabai sat at her desk, watching through her glass walls as her team moved like a well-oiled machine. Ji-suk was currently standing by the filing cabinets, and even the air around him seemed to tremble. He was organized, efficient, and utterly terrified without even trying. "You've done more for this company in 4 hours than most consultants do in a month," Nabai whispered when he brought her a cup of perfectly brewed tea. Ji-suk leaned down, his face inches from hers. "Efficiency is easy when people understand the cost of failure," he said softly. Nabai felt a chill. He spoke as if he were discussing a business strategy, but she knew that in his world, the cost of failure was usually paid in blood. She had wanted an assistant to help her manage her life, but as she looked at her terrified staff, she realized she had given the office a new master. She was ruling the boardroom, but Ji-suk was ruling the souls of everyone inside it. In a dark, smoke-filled room on the other side of the city, the man who had orchestrated Ji-suk's fall leaned over a glowing tablet. Min-ho, once Ji-suk's most trusted lieutenant, and now the self-proclaimed king of the underworld, was scowling at the screen. He was looking at a viral video titled "Mystery Bodyguard Saves CEO from Thugs." The footage was grainy, captured by a bystander's phone outside Nabai's penthouse, but the way the man in the video moved was unmistakable. He watched as a tall, broad-shouldered man dismantled 3 debt collectors with a cold, terrifying efficiency. He saw the way the man gripped the leader by the throat, hoisting him into the air like he was nothing. Min-ho's hand trembled, and his cigarette ash fell onto his expensive leather chair. "Impossible," he hissed. "I watched him bleed out in that alley. I saw the light go out of his eyes." He replayed the clip, pausing on a blurry frame of the man's face. The man in the video was well-groomed, wearing a sharp suit and standing beside a beautiful black woman. He looked like a civilized gentleman, a devoted partner. But Min-ho knew better. He recognized that slight tilt of the head and the frozen, merciless expression that promised death to anyone who crossed him. "He's alive," Min-ho whispered, the color draining from his face. "The Ghost King is still breathing." One of his subordinates stepped forward, looking at the screen. "Boss, he looks different. He's working as an assistant for some corporate lady named Nabai. Word on the street is he doesn't even know who he is. They say he's got no memory." Min-ho let out a harsh, jagged laugh that held no joy. "Amnesia? The most dangerous man in Asia is playing house with a businesswoman?" He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the glasses. "It doesn't matter if he remembers or not. A tiger is still a tiger, even if it thinks it's a cat. If he stays alive, my head is on the chopping block. He is a ghost haunting my city, and I need him buried for real this time." He turned to his men, his eyes burning with a desperate, murderous fire. "Find out everything about this woman, Nabai. Find out where they sleep, where they eat, and who she thinks he is. If she's the one keeping him hidden, she's just as dead as he is." As the henchmen hurried out to execute the order, Minho stared at the frozen image of Ji-suk. The hunt was back on. The city wasn't big enough for two kings, and the Ghost King's return meant that blood would soon stain the streets once again. Nabai had no idea that the viral video meant to celebrate her hero had just painted a giant target on both of their backs. The grand ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sparkling diamonds. Nabai stood at the entrance, her heart racing beneath her elegant gown. This gala was the most important social event of the year, and all eyes were on her. Beside her, Ji-suk looked breathtaking in a custom-fitted tuxedo. He carried himself with such effortless grace that no one would ever guess he had been found bleeding in an alley just weeks ago. "Just stay close to me," Nabai whispered, adjusting her silk gloves. "These people are sharks. They'll look for any reason to tear us down." "Let them try," Ji-suk replied, his voice low and steady. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a king inspecting his subjects. The night was going perfectly until a loud, arrogant voice cut through the music. Well, if it isn't Nabai. I see you finally found a stray to bring as your date." Nabai froze. It was Julian, her ex-boyfriend and a prominent investor, who had never forgiven her for ending their relationship. He walked over, a smirk on his face and a glass of champagne in his hand. A crowd began to gather, sensing blood in the water. "Tell me, Nabai," Julian said, loud enough for the nearby socialites to hear. "Is it true you picked this Gene character up off the street? I've checked his credentials. No schools, no previous firms, nothing. He's a fraud, isn't he? Just a pretty face you hired to keep from looking lonely." Nabai's face burned with shame. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but her voice failed her. The lie was being exposed in front of everyone who mattered. Ji-suk stepped forward. He didn't look angry. He looked dangerously calm. He didn't argue about credentials or schools. Instead, he stepped into Julian's personal space, moving with a silent, predatory speed that made Julian stumble back. "You speak a lot about value," Ji-suk said, his voice dropping to a chilling level that made the room go quiet. "But in my world, a man's value isn't on a piece of paper. It's in his silence and his respect." Ji-suk reached out and gripped Julian's silk tie, tightening it just enough to be a threat. "You have spent the last 5 minutes embarrassing a woman who is far above you. That is a debt you cannot afford to pay." He leaned in closer, his eyes turning into shards of ice. "If you say another word, I won't just ruin your reputation. I will take everything you own, starting with that smile. Do we have an understanding? Or do I need to be more clear?" Julian turned pale. He looked into Ji-suk's eyes and saw something so dark and ancient that his hands began to shake. He realized this was a businessman. This was a man who knew exactly how to make people disappear. Without a word, Julian turned and fled the ballroom, nearly tripping over his own feet. The elite crowd stood in stunned silence. Ji-suk turned back to Nabai, his expression softening instantly as he offered her his arm. "Shall we dance, Nabai?" he asked gently. As they moved to the center of the floor, Nabai realized that while she had saved Ji-suk's life, he was the one now ruling her world. He had used the logic of a monster to protect her, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she was more relieved or terrified. The gala had been a victory, but the air in the penthouse felt heavy that night. While Nabai slept, Ji-suk stood on the balcony, watching the city lights. The silence of the high-rise usually calmed him, but tonight, his mind felt like a radio trying to tune into a station that didn't exist. The next morning, Nabai asked him to help her organize a storage closet filled with old corporate files and personal items. As Ji-suk moved a heavy crate, he knocked over a small, vintage wooden box. It flew open, spilling its contents across the floor. Among the papers was a small, dried bottle of gun oil and a heavy metallic lighter. As Ji-suk picked them up, the sharp, chemical scent of the oil hit him. It was a cold, industrial smell, bitter and sharp. Suddenly, The world around him tilted. The bright, modern kitchen vanished. In his mind, the sun was replaced by a dim, flickering light in the basement. He didn't feel like Gene the assistant anymore. He felt a familiar weight in his right hand, the cold, balanced steel of a customized handgun. He heard the metallic click-clack of a slide being pulled back. He smelled the gunpowder and the copper tang of blood. He saw a man kneeling before him, begging for mercy, and he felt nothing. No pity, only a dark, frozen sense of duty. The flashback was so violent that Ji-suk gasped, dropping the oil bottle. It shattered on the floor, the scent filling the room. "Jean, are you okay?" Na-bai hurried over, her face full of concern. She reached out to touch his arm, but for the first time, Ji-suk flinched. He pulled away from her, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. He looked at his hands. They were clean, soft, and well-manicured. But in his mind, they were covered in stains that no soap could wash away. He looked at Na-bai, this beautiful, professional woman who told him they had spent 2 years in love. She told him he was a businessman. She told him he was gentle. "Na-bai," he said, his voice sounding like breaking glass. "You said we met at a conference. You said I worked in finance." Yes, that's right," she stammered, her eyes darting toward the door. The lie was visible in the way her pulse throbbed in her neck. Ji-suk stepped toward her, his shadow looming large against the white walls. The Gene persona was cracking, and the Ghost King was peering through the fissures. Then why do my hands remember how to strip a weapon in 3 seconds? Why does the smell of oil make me want to hunt? He leaned down, his eyes searching hers with a terrifying intensity. "Who am I really, Na-bai? Because the man in my head isn't the man you described. He's a killer." Na-bai backed away, her heart hammering. The safe, controlled life she had built was falling apart. She had saved a man, but the monster was finally waking up, and he was starting to realize that his fiancé was his captor. The following morning, the atmosphere in Na-bai's office was thick with unsaid questions. Ji-suk moved like a shadow behind her, his silence no longer peaceful but heavy with the dark thoughts of the night before. Na-bai tried to focus on her laptop, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She had lied to a predator, and now that predator was beginning to remember his claws. A soft knock at the glass door broke the silence. A young man in a bright yellow courier vest stood there, holding a large cardboard box and a digital clipboard. "Package for Director Na-bai," the courier said, his voice flat and robotic. "I didn't order anything," Na-bai muttered, reaching for a pen. Ji-suk stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. He didn't look at the package. He looked at the courier's hands. The man was wearing leather gloves despite the warmth of the office, and his right hand was dipped slightly into the side of the box. "Stop," Ji-suk commanded. The word was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The courier didn't stop. In one fluid motion, he dropped the clipboard, and the side of the box fell away to reveal a suppressed handgun. "Ji-suk!" Na-bai screamed, throwing herself backward. In that split second, the world slowed down for Ji-suk. The Gene persona, the polite assistant, the gentle fiancé, shattered like glass. The fog in his brain cleared instantly, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. He didn't think. He reacted. Before the assassin could pull the trigger, Ji-suk lunged across the desk. He grabbed the assassin's wrist, twisting it with a sickening pop that forced the gun to point at the ceiling. A muffled thud echoed as a bullet hit the acoustic tiles. Ji-suk didn't stop there. He delivered a brutal strike to the man's throat and followed it with a knee to the chest that sent the assassin crashing to the glass office wall. The entire floor erupted in screams, but Ji-suk was a statue of ice. He walked through the shattered glass, picked up the fallen gun, and checked the chamber with a practiced, terrifying flick of his wrist. He looked down at the bleeding man on the floor, his eyes completely void of light. "Who sent you?" Ji-suk asked. It wasn't a question. It was a demand from a king. The assassin gasped for air, his eyes wide with primal fear. The Ghost King! He's really back," he wheezed. Ji-suk stood tall, the weapon looking like a natural extension of his arm. He turned to look at Na-bai, who was trembling behind her desk, staring at him as if he were a ghost. The gentle man she had created was gone. Standing before her was the most dangerous man in the city, fully awake and covered in the dust of his own broken memories. "Lock the doors, Nabai," Jisuk said, his voice cold and commanding. "The Jin you knew is dead, and I think it's time we discuss the man who just took his place." That scene marks a definitive turning point in the story. The Jin persona served as a protective shield for both of them, but now that the Ghost King has surfaced, the power dynamic has shifted completely. Here is the next chapter based on your outline. The click of the door's lock echoed like a gunshot in the silent office. Nabai leaned against the heavy wood, her breath coming in shallow hitches. On the floor, the assassin lay unconscious amidst shards of broken glass, but he was no longer the most frightening person in the room. Jisuk stood by the window, silhouetted against the city skyline he used to rule. He was stripping the captured handgun with a terrifying, rhythmic speed, his fingers moving by instinct. He didn't look like an assistant. He didn't look like a fiancé. He looked like a god of war who had finally found his thunderbolt. "Who am I, Nabai?" he asked. He didn't turn around, but his voice felt like a cold blade against her skin. "I remember the smell of gunpowder. I remember the weight of a body. I remember men kneeling before me, terrified of my shadow. That isn't the life of a venture capitalist." Nabai felt the weight of her lies crushing her. I found you in an alley," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You were dying. I was scared. If the police found a man like you and me, my career, my whole life, would have been destroyed. I gave you a name to save myself. I didn't know you were this." Jisuk finally turned. His eyes were no longer clouded with confusion. They were sharp, dark, and predatory. He stepped toward her, his polished shoes crunching on the glass. He stopped just inches away, forcing her to look up into the face of the man the underworld called the Ghost King. "You used me," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were brushed against her ear. "You turned a monster into a pet to satisfy your family and protect your reputation. You lied to a man who was killed for much less than a broken heart." Nabai closed her eyes, expecting his rage. Instead, she felt his hand, the same hand that had just broken a man's wrist, gently cup her cheek. His touch was electric, a mixture of terrifying dominance and a strange, lingering affection that hadn't died with his memories. "The man you created, Jean, loved you," Jisuk said, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "But the man I am, he finds your deception fascinating." The air between them was thick, with a new kind of danger. Nabai realized then that the truth was far more complicated than the lie. She had wanted to control him, but by bringing his memories back, she had handed the leash to the wolf. "What happens now?" she gasped. Jisuk pulled back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, one that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Now, we play a different game. You wanted a powerful husband to show off to the world? Fine. But from now on, Nabai, you aren't the one giving the orders." He tossed the disassembled gun onto her desk with a heavy thud. "Now, we find out who sent that dog into our house. And then I'm going to remind the city why they were afraid of the dark." The following evening, the sunset over the city was the color of a fresh bruise. Inside the penthouse, the air was silent and heavy. Nabai stood by the window, watching the black sedans pull up to the curb far below. She didn't need to be told who they were. The tinted windows and the way they blocked the entrance told her that the Ghost King's past had finally come to collect him. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jisuk didn't look up from the kitchen island. He was calmly buttoning the cuffs of a fresh white shirt, his movements slow and deliberate. The Jean she had known, the helpful, soft-spoken man, was completely gone. In his place stood a man who looked like he was preparing for a coronation or an execution. A heavy, synchronized thud echoed from the hallway. Then the sound of her expensive electronic lock being bypassed with sharp, digital hiss. The double doors swung open, and a dozen men in dark suits flooded into the foyer. They were armed, their faces masks of cold stone. At their head stood Minho, the man who had betrayed Jisuk in the rain. "Boss," Minho said, his voice a mixture of mockery and fear. "The streets were getting lonely without you. We heard you were playing house with a corporate girl. We've come to bring you back to your throne, or put you in a coffin, whichever fits better." The gunmen leveled their weapons at Nabai. She froze, the cold grip of terror seizing her heart. Jisuk stepped into the center of the room. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stood there, his shadow stretching across the marble floor. He looked at Minho, and for a second, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. It was a look of absolute, soul-crushing authority. "Lower your toys," Jisuk commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a god. To Nabai's shock, two of the men in the back instinctively lowered their barrels. The habit of obeying him was deeper than their loyalty to a traitor. "You think you can lead them, Minho?" Jisuk asked, stepping closer until the muzzle of Minho's gun was pressed against his chest. He didn't flinch. "You couldn't even kill me when I was half dead in the mud. How do you plan to stop me now that I'm standing right in front of you?" The silence was deafening. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. Jisuk glanced back at Nabai, and for the briefest moment, a flash of the man she had created appeared in his eyes, a silent promise of safety. Then he turned back to the syndicate, his face turning into a mask of iron. "This woman is mine," Jisuk announced to the room, his voice booming like thunder. "If a single one of you breathes in her direction, I won't just kill you. I will erase your entire bloodline. Now, Minho, get on your knees. The king is home." In that moment, Nabai realized that while the lie was over, a much more dangerous truth had begun. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was the queen of a world built on blood, and Jisuk was ready to burn the city down to keep her safe. The city was buried under a thick, suffocating fog, but Jisuk moved to the shipyard like a ghost coming home. He had left Nabai under protection of his most loyal guards, the ones who wept when they realized their king was alive. Now he was alone. He didn't want an army. He wanted a reckoning. This wasn't just about the throne anymore. It was about making sure that no one would ever dare to look at Nabai's penthouse and think of it as a target. He entered the warehouse where the traders had gathered, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows. Minho was there, surrounded by 30 armed men, but as the doors groaned open, the air went still. Jisuk didn't carry a rifle or wear armor. He walked in with his hands in his pockets, his eyes cold and empty, radiating a level of confidence that terrified them more than any weapon could. "Kill him!" Minho screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. The warehouse erupted into chaos, but Jisuk was a whirlwind of calculated destruction. He moved with a speed that defied human logic, turning their own momentum against them. He didn't just fight, he dismantled. Every strike was silent and final. He was a master of the dark arts of combat, slipping through a hail of bullets as if he could see their path before they were even fired. Blood began to stain the concrete floor, echoing the patterns of the dragon on his back. One by one, the men who had betrayed him fell. Jisuk wasn't fueled by rage. He was fueled by a cold, protective duty. Every time he broke a bone or disarmed an opponent, he pictured Nabai's face. He was pruning the thorns from her life, so she could finally walk without fear. Finally, only Minho remained, backed into a corner behind a stack of shipping crates. He held a shaking gun, his face drenched in sweat. Jisuk walked toward him, his white shirt now splattered with red, looking like a demon reborn. "You took my memory," Jisuk said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You tried to take my life. But your biggest mistake was trying to take her." He didn't give Minho a chance to beg. With a single swift motion, Jisuk ended the betrayal that started in that rain-drenched alley weeks ago. The silence that followed was absolute. The Ghost King stood alone in the center of the carnage, the undisputed ruler of the darkness once again. He pulled out his phone, his blood-stained fingers tapping out a simple message to Nabai. "It's over. You're safe." As he walked out into the cool night air, the dragon on his back felt heavier than ever. He had won the war, but he knew the man who returned to Nabai wouldn't be Jean the assistant. He was the king, and the world was his kingdom, but his heart belonged to the woman who had dared to lie to a monster. The morning sun broke through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Nabai's office, but the atmosphere was no longer one of fear. It was one of absolute, unquestioned power. Jisuk stood by her side, not as a silent assistant or a hidden secret, but as an equal. The blood had been washed away, and the chaos of the shipyard was a memory buried deep in the city's concrete. Ji-suk placed a leather folder on Na-bai's desk. Inside were the legal documents for a massive multi-billion-dollar investment. He had emptied the shadow accounts of the syndicate, turning dirty money into a legal lifeline that would make Na-bai's company the largest conglomerate in the country. He was effectively dismantling the underworld by moving its wealth into the light. "The board of directors is waiting," Na-bai said, her voice steady and confident. She looked at the man beside her. He was still the Ghost King, but he had chosen a new throne. "Are you ready to show them who really runs the city?" Ji-suk leaned down and kissed her forehead, a rare moment of tenderness that belonged only to her. "I told you once that the man you created, Gene, loved you. He still does. But now, he has the power to make sure no one ever stands in your way again." As they walked into the boardroom together, the room went dead silent. The executives who had once bullied Na-bai didn't just sit up straight. They held their breath. They saw the way Ji-suk moved, the grace of a predator who had decided to become a protector. They saw the way Na-bai held her head high, no longer afraid of corporate backstabbing or family pressure. They were no longer just a CEO and her fiancé. They were a dynasty. Na-bai handled the strategy, the vision, and the public face of their empire. Ji-suk handled the problems that the law couldn't reach, ensuring that their competitors stayed honest and their enemies stayed away. That evening, as they stood on the balcony of their penthouse, looking out over the sparkling skyline, Na-bai realized the truth. She had started this journey with a desperate lie to save her career. She had tried to tame a monster, but in the end, she hadn't changed him and he hadn't destroyed her. Instead, they had built something entirely new, a world where the predator and the professional ruled side by side. Was it worth it? Ji-suk asked, pulling her back against his chest. Na-bai looked at the city lights, then at the reflection of the dragon tattoo visible through his thin white shirt. She smiled, feeling safer than she ever had in her life. "Every bit of it," she whispered. The lie was gone, but the love and the power was very, very real.